Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're unpacking a really extraordinary set of sources. They blend this brutal personal memoir with a pretty radical historical analysis.
Yeah, it's a fascinating combination. We're following the journey of a man who finds this absolute clarity. He actually calls it the IS.
And he only gets there after a profound physical and psychological collapse. We're talking a near-death experience.
Exactly. And that clarity, that IS, it leads him to this controversial but really compelling idea. He starts to see a kind of structural, non-religious blueprint for human harmony.
A blueprint hidden inside the teachings of a central historical figure.
Right. And he's not suggesting it was mystical advice. He says it was a survival protocol for civilization itself.
So our mission in this deep dive is to extract those key structural insights for you. How does a life lived without, the comfort of illusion? A life forged in hardship. How does that reveal a 2,000-year-old protocol for preventing societal collapse?
And we're going to look at integrity not as some kind of subjective virtue.
No, but as a foundational, necessary component. He literally calls it the backbone of existence.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack that foundation. The source is very clear that his path wasn't, born from seeking enlightenment.
Not at all. It was grounded in a just raw survival.
He talks about his early life as being incredibly unpredictable, loud, and that it taught him a fundamental law of existence.
The world does not arrange itself for your comfort.
Right. You adapt or you get flattened. Simple as that.
And that kind of environment, it forces you into this state of intense observation. He learned pretty early on that integrity wasn't something you preach, it's something you live.
He points to his father, right?
Yes, his father, who refused to bend his own moral code, even when it cost him a lot. And from that, he got his definition. Integrity is just how you behave when nobody is watching.
But even with that, that grounding, he talks about this intense internal war. He calls it the pendulum.
Yeah, swinging between this like self-aggrandizing arrogance on one side.
And then complete destructive self-sacrifice on the other.
And he saw that both of them were just defenses. They were masks built over the same wound.
An exhausting way to live.
Completely exhausting. And it only slows down when the self, the thing wearing the masks, is finally stripped bare. And what's so crucial here is that his awakening, it didn't start with a spiritual revelation. It was the slow, painful stripping away of illusions.
And the core truth he landed on is actually pretty chilling.
It is that people cling to illusions because reality terrifies them. And he says they will fight to protect the illusion long before they ever question it.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, if you accept reality, you also have to accept accountability for your part in it.
Right. And the source says the first cracks started to appear for him when he realized that, true righteousness doesn't come from what you believe. It comes from your behavior.
A structural view of reality.
Exactly. And that view put him immediately at odds with pretty much all the inherited systems that valued conformity over, truth.
And this is where his work as a craftsman comes in. You mentioned this was vital preparation.
Oh, absolutely. Painting, mechanics, construction. He calls it learning through doing. Metal taught him structure. An engine taught him absolute cause and effect. There's no faking it.
It's not about status.
No, not at all. It was about grounding abstract ideas in tangible, real-world mastery. That mastery provided the stability, he calls it the ballast, so that when his consciousness did finally expand, he didn't just float away into, mysticism or ego.
Okay, so here's where the personal journey really accelerates toward that central claim. Those decades of motion and hard-won lessons, they lead to the ultimate collapse.
And he details these earlier failures, career loss, losing faith in systems that valued profit over actual craft.
But he reframes them. They weren't failures. They were preparations.
Preparations for a greater stripping away. It's this idea that any identity you build on an illusion or on fear, it has to die eventually for anything real to come through. Growth is brutal.
Awakening costs you everything that was borrowed.
Exactly. But the final stripping away, that wasn't a choice. It was a calamity.
That calamity was a series of strokes. And he describes it not as just a medical event. He calls it an annihilation.
When the lights went out, identity was the first thing to go, then memory.
What's really astonishing is his description of it. He says he couldn't feel fear.
Because fear requires a self. I did not have one.
Wow.
And this is where he gets to the core philosophical insight of the sources, what he calls the paradox of being.
Right. When the self collapsed, what was left?
Pure being, the IS. He describes it as the fundamental operating system of awareness that runs underneath all the temporary applications, ego, memory, identity.
And the realization was, I am not the self, I am the awareness behind the self, and awareness cannot die.
A profound and, like you said earlier, a very sober conclusion to draw from that kind of experience.
It is. But that raises a critical question. If the trauma annihilated his identity and memory, how did he then access all this deep historical and structural analysis? I mean, the Q document, the first century Judean political climate, that's not something you just intuit.
That's a great question, and the sources are really clear on this. The event itself didn't deliver the history lessons. The event dissolved the filters.
Yeah.
His brain became a blank slate. The trauma forced his core awareness to become, well, undeniable. And the next 5 years were this slow, painstaking reconstruction. But now all the old emotional barriers, the identity defenses, they were gone.
So the patterns were always there, he just couldn't see them before.
Precisely. The historical patterns in our collective story just suddenly aligned into what he calls pure, unobstructed clarity, or my favorite phrase, pattern recognition uncaged.
So the recovery wasn't about going back to who he was. It was about building a new structure from scratch.
On a clean foundation. And he notes this all happened in what he calls Eden, his quiet home, which basically became a living laboratory for this idea of structural harmony.
And he uses this small domestic example.
Yes, and it's so powerful. He talks about a dog, a parrot, and a rescued raccoon, all coexisting in trust and love. These are animals that should be natural enemies.
But they weren't.
And he saw this as proof that awakening does not require gods or rituals. It only requires attention. Attention to the underlying structures of how things interact. Harmony wasn't some lofty moral goal. It's a practical, observable law.
It's all about behavior over hierarchy.
Yes. And once he had that uncaged pattern recognition, he just applied it universally.
Which brings us to the most radical claim in the sources, that Jesus was not primarily a mystical figure, but a structural engineer.
A trauma psychologist 2,000 years ahead of schedule.
Providing a specific survival method for a collapsing first-century society.
What he's postulating is that when you strip away all the theological layers that were added later, you're left with a system designed to structurally dismantle cycles of vengeance and institutional power.
It was all behavioral. How do you act when you're under occupation? What do you do with people who despise you?
Exactly.
So let's look at the mechanics of that. Turn the other cheek, for instance, is so often mistaken for just, submission.
But he says it's strategic non-escalation. It's an ethical reversal. You're refusing to participate in the cycle of violence.
And love your enemy. That's not a feeling. It's a strategy. It's trauma interruption.
Yeah.
You're breaking the feedback loop of harm.
And forgiveness is absolutely critical to the whole structure. It's the societal reset button. It stops historical harm from metastasizing into future violence.
Which is what fractures civilizations.
It's what collapses them. And you see, his harshest criticism, it wasn't for sinners or outsiders. It was for the hypocrisy in religious leaders, the moral theater. The source argues that collapses civilizations faster than any foreign enemy.
And this whole structural interpretation, it really gains a lot of weight when you look at the historical context he brings in, specifically the Q document.
Right. For anyone who doesn't know, this is a hypothetical source that scholars believe Matthew and Luke used, and it's basically just a list of sayings. It's a structural ethic. There's no virgin birth, no resurrection stories.
So the focus wasn't on the vox, the exact words, or the miracle claims.
No, it was on the ipsima intentio, the intended structural meaning. The original message was all about accountable power, the danger of excessive wealth, and putting integrity above any kind of tribal identity.
And a plan like that, one that advocates for personal accountability, decentralized morality, questioning all authority, that is fundamentally dangerous.
Oh, it's a direct threat to all existing institutions. The Roman Empire, the temple hierarchy in Jerusalem, any future political machine that relies on control.
Which leads directly to what he calls the Great Inversion.
Precisely. Because the original blueprint was inherently corrosive to centralized power, the institutions that adopting it, well, they had to flip it upside down to survive and maintain control.
So let's get into the mechanics of that flip. The idea of non-reciprocity, the strategy for the oppressed to non-violently resist, that got twisted into obedience.
Turning it into a tool for the powerful.
Exactly. And the moral core just shifted completely. Integrity, which was about how you act in the real world.
Was inverted to identity. Are you one of the saved? Do you belong to our group? The focus on behavior was replaced with a focus on tribal loyalty.
And the final and maybe the biggest, inversion was shifting the goal itself, the inner kingdom, this idea of structural alignment and harmony that's
Yeah.
available right now.
Was replaced by the external afterlife, a future reward you get for compliance now. So your focus shifts from keeping this world habitable to just trying to escape it.
And there's the disconnect. The message went from a challenging, high accountability survival guide to a comforting, low accountability insurance policy.
A profound and, frankly, a tragic flip.
Okay, so let's bring this structural analysis right back to our present moment. The sources argue we are facing the exact same structural crisis today.
The cycles of trauma, the political extremism, institutional rot, the social fragmentation that's driven by identity politics.
The dynamics of collapse, he argues, haven't changed in 2,000 years.
And this systemic failure is driven by what he calls extinction logic. Our current systems, which are built on that inverted plan, they structurally reward loyalty to the group over personal integrity.
Can you give us a concrete example? How does rewarding loyalty over integrity lead to that kind of systemic risk?
Sure. Think of it this way. If a system rewards loyalty, let's say keeping silent about malpractice in a company over integrity, which would be reporting the truth, then the feedback loop of that whole system becomes dishonest.
The people at the top aren't getting real information.
Exactly. If leaders only get pleasant, compliant information, they can't steer the system away from danger. So this unconstrained, uninformed power, whether it's in a corporation or a government, it becomes structurally blind to its own fatal flaws.
It's prioritizing short-term identity comfort over long-term structural viability.
And that brings us back to his core principle. Harmony isn't some subjective moral code. It is a fundamental law of existence.
It operates like physics.
It operates like physics. You can ignore gravity, but your system still breaks when you step off the cliff. Alignment isn't optional. It's the price of structural survival.
So the path forward, according to the sources, isn't some kind of spiritual revival.
No, it's structural repair. It requires accountability at every level, a relentless focus on behavior, and shifting our whole concept of salvation away from escaping this world.
To actively making the structures of this world habitable for generations to come.
The entire purpose of his writing, he says, is not to be a guru or start some new movement. It's to light a lantern bright enough that someone wandering in the dark might recognize the shape of their own doorway.
The work is complete when you see the structure for yourself. So the path of personal integrity, the IS, and the path of civilizational integrity, the blueprint, they're revealed to be one and the same thing.
And both of them depend on letting go of comforting illusions. The sources argue pretty strongly that the original structural teachings were designed to prevent the very collapse we're currently watching unfold.
Not to guarantee entry into an afterlife. The focus was always here and now. So we'll leave you with this final thought to consider. We've allowed institutions to convince us that salvation is only for the afterlife. If personal awakening is contagious and the survival is truly structural, why do we continue to prioritize seeking short-term comfort and tribal identity over confronting the explicit collapse signals in our own lives? And more importantly, who truly benefits from that widespread distraction?